To give you a little behind-the-scenes insight into the liturgy, something you might have realized from the readings in the Breaking Bread, there are some readings at Mass where we can choose the long form or the short form. They're not overly common, and usually it has to do with the long form being, well, long. But today we had the choice to eliminate these lines from our second reading. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children so they may not become discouraged. And in this case, I think some choose to omit this section, not so much for the sake of brevity, as because it can sound offensive or out of touch to our modern ears. And admittedly, it is difficult to speak on another subject while leaving this unaddressed. But today I want to look at what can be said about this section, because it is still sacred scripture. And so the first thing I find fascinating is that when this was written, people might have had a similar first reaction to us today, discomfort or even anger. But while we cringe the most at the line, "Wives, be subordinate to your husbands," back then many might have taken offense at the line, "Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them." At that time, women were wrongly, but widely considered second-class citizens, lower in dignity than men. And I am not trying to say that the opposite is true now, just that it's a little ironic that then this would have been seen as wrongly putting down men, and now we see it as wrongly putting down women, when right from the start the scriptures have promoted equal dignity between men and women. Eve, after all, came from the side of Adam, not his head and not his feet, his side. The second thing we have to remember is that Paul was writing to a specific audience, in this case the church in Colossae, which was, at the time, struggling with a number of issues. We don't know what Paul saw in the people that he felt he needed to say these specific words. And while we do need to keep in mind their specific nature, the universal nature of Scripture is also a reality. And I think that the heart of the universal nature of what Paul is trying to say here is best found in the first part of that reading. And to better understand this, we need another behind the scenes of the liturgy moment. What the priest wears at Mass is called the chasuble, and underneath this is the stole. The stole represents authority and comes from the attire of authority figures in the Roman Empire. Priests wear stoles during confession, for example, to show that we are acting with the authority of Christ to forgive sins. But at Mass, we cover this symbol of authority with the chasuble, which should remind us of the love that St. Paul says should cover all authority. He says in our reading, "And over all these put on love." Without love, authority becomes tyranny. With love, proper earthly authority gains a share in the authority of God. Today we celebrate the Feast of the Holy Family, the model given to us for all families. The family is the institution at the heart of society, and on which the Church bases many of her titles, such as father, mother, sister, and brother. Within the Holy Family, Mary was sinless, and Jesus was God, which put Joseph in an interesting position. Yet the instructions in our gospel today from God to flee into Egypt come not through Mary or Jesus, but through Joseph. Despite our unease, I think Paul's advice on authority, and that we find in Sirach, is still relevant, but between all members of the family. Spouses, while equal in dignity, are not equal in all things. For example, it could be at times that we have to know to ask for help in an area that's difficult for us but might be easier for our spouse. Or other times we have to be willing to accept advice or correction with humility when it is necessary. And even when it is not necessary, to still give that advice honest consideration, as Paul speaks about the necessity of admonishing. Again, the key here is over all things put on love. But the example of Joseph takes this a step further. It can be difficult to accept advice from a spouse or any family member or anyone in an area where they are more knowledgeable or skilled, but it can be all the more difficult to accept that advice in an area where we feel superior. Many of us in Mary's place probably would have been tempted to say something like, "What do you mean we have to uproot our lives and move to Egypt? The angel didn't even come to you when you were awake? Just leave the talking to angels thing to me, dear." Fortunately, Mary had a much holier and healthier approach. The stressors of Christmas time can undoubtedly put strain on all kinds of family relationships. Not just husbands and wives, but children and parents, cousins, siblings, and everything in between. If in these moments we put on the heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, and forgiveness, but above all love, we too can share in the peace and the joy of the Holy Family, despite the chaos and even the dangers of the world around us. In all our relationships, but especially in our families, let the peace of Christ control your hearts. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, and over all these, put on love.